For most of my life, I believed family was one of those things you simply never questioned. You could argue with them, distance yourself for a while, or even feel disappointed by some of their decisions. But deep down I always assumed there were certain lines nobody would ever cross, especially when children were involved. For years I believed my father and my sister could be difficult, controlling, and even manipulative when things didn't go their way, but I never imagined that one day I would return home and discover they had terrified my daughter while searching through my belongings like criminals looking for evidence of a crime. And I certainly never imagined that they would end up handing me all the evidence I needed to destroy every excuse they would later try to invent. If you enjoy stories about family betrayal, hidden secrets, and people who eventually face the consequences of their own actions, subscribe to Unspoken Truth, because we share stories like this every day. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I am 39 years old and the mother of a daughter named Emma. After my divorce, Emma became the center of my entire world. Every decision I made revolved around her well-being, her safety, and the stable life I was trying to build for both of us. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I felt like everything depended entirely on me and that a single mistake could affect my daughter directly. But over time we managed to create a peaceful life. We had a small but comfortable home, a reliable routine, and a relationship that was incredibly close. Emma was a kind, intelligent child, and far more mature than most children her age. She had always been calm and rarely caused problems, which is why the moment I saw her trembling that afternoon, I immediately knew something was terribly wrong. To understand how we reached that point, I need to talk about my family, especially my father, Robert, and my younger sister, Jennifer. For years we maintained a complicated relationship that became significantly worse after my mother's death. She had always been the one person capable of keeping balance within the family. She was the one who calmed arguments, prevented resentment from growing too large, and somehow managed to ensure even the most uncomfortable family gatherings ended peacefully. When she passed away, everything changed, especially when discussions about inheritance and family property began to surface. At first, I believed we could resolve everything like reasonable adults. After all, we weren't talking about a massive fortune or enough money to completely change anyone's life. But I quickly learned that for some people the issue is never the amount involved. The issue is the possibility that someone else might receive something they believe belongs to them. My father became obsessed with certain documents related to old properties that had once belonged to my grandparents, while Jennifer convinced herself there were hidden papers proving that a larger portion of the inheritance should belong to them. I repeatedly explained that I had no secret information, no hidden documents, and no control over decisions that had been made years earlier, but the more I insisted, the more suspicious they became. For months I received strange phone calls, repetitive questions, and increasingly aggressive comments. My father wanted to know where I stored certain files. Jennifer constantly asked whether I had discovered old boxes among my mother's belongings, and both of them seemed obsessed with the idea that I was deliberately hiding something important. At first I tried to remain patient because I understood that grief affects people differently, but eventually it stopped feeling like a family disagreement and started feeling more like a paranoid investigation, where I had somehow become the primary suspect. The situation became even worse when I discovered several old folders while organizing personal records. They contained tax documents, outdated property paperwork, and legal files that attorneys had already reviewed years before. Nothing especially valuable, nothing capable of changing any inheritance distribution. However, the moment my father learned I possessed those folders, his behavior changed immediately. He insisted that I hand everything over so he could personally examine their contents. Jennifer began calling almost every day asking whether I had found anything else, and for the first time I began to feel that their interest went far beyond ordinary family curiosity. It was during that period that I decided to install security cameras throughout the house. I didn't do it because I feared a burglary or because I specifically suspected either of them. The truth was that there had been several minor incidents in the neighborhood and it seemed like a reasonable precaution. I installed cameras near the front entrance, the back door, and several interior locations covering the main access points of the house. After everything was set up, I practically forgot they existed. I never imagined they would eventually capture something far more disturbing than a random thief trying to break into my home. A few months later, an unexpected work trip came up. It wasn't especially long, only a few days away from home. I organized everything carefully, hired a trusted babysitter to help with Emma during certain hours, and left detailed instructions in case of emergencies. Before leaving, I spoke with Emma and promised I will be back soon. She seemed perfectly fine, even excited about having a little extra independence while I was away. When I walked out the front door that morning, I had absolutely no reason to believe anything was about to go wrong. However, during the second night of my trip, I received a phone call from the babysitter that struck me as unusual. She mentioned that Emma seemed quieter than normal and appeared nervous for reasons she couldn't explain. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I assumed she simply missed me or was struggling to adjust to the temporary routine while I was gone. I spoke with Emma on the phone, and although she sounded distant, she insisted everything was fine. So I tried not to worry. What I didn't know was that while I was hundreds of miles away, two people who knew my house better than almost anyone had decided to enter it without permission, convinced they would finally find the evidence they had been searching for all these years. And worst of all, my daughter was there when it happened, completely alone, facing a situation no child should ever experience. A situation that would be captured by the security cameras and would ultimately change my relationship with my father and my sister forever. The morning I returned home seemed completely normal. After several days away, I was tired, but I was also happy to return to my routine and, most importantly, to see Emma again. During the drive back from the airport, I found myself thinking about all the little things I had missed: our conversations during dinner, the movies we watched together on weekends, and the simple comfort of knowing the people you love most are nearby. However, the moment I stepped through the front door, I felt that something was off. It wasn't anything obvious. The house wasn't destroyed, there were no broken windows, and there were no clear signs of a burglary. But there was a strange feeling lingering in the air, as if someone had been there when they shouldn't have been. The first thing that caught my attention was Emma. Normally she would run to greet me the second she heard the door open, but this time she stood still for a few moments before hugging me much tighter than usual. She tried to smile, she tried to act normal, but I could see something in her eyes that immediately worried me. There was a tension there that I had never seen before. When I asked whether everything was okay, she answered yes far too quickly, exactly the way children answer when they hope adults will stop asking questions. And that alone was enough to make me uneasy. Throughout the rest of the day, I noticed more small details that only increased my concern. Emma startled more easily than usual. She kept glancing toward the windows, and more than once she asked whether I planned to travel again anytime soon. The more I observed her, the more convinced I became that something had happened while I was away. Finally, that evening, after dinner when we were alone in the kitchen, I decided to ask her directly whether anyone had visited the house during my trip. For several seconds she remained silent, staring down at the table while nervously playing with her hands. Then she asked me a question that I still remember perfectly. She asked whether Grandpa and Aunt Jennifer were angry with me. The moment those words left her mouth, I felt a knot form in my stomach, because that was not the kind of question a child asks without a reason, especially a child who should not have been involved in adult conflicts at all. I forced myself to remain calm and asked why she would think that. Emma hesitated for a moment as though she was still deciding whether she should tell me what happened. Then she finally began to speak, and with every sentence my concern grew stronger. She explained that 2 days earlier my father and Jennifer had come to the house. They told her they needed to get inside to look for something important and assured her that I already knew about it. Emma believed them because they were family, because they were people she had known her entire life, and because she had no reason to suspect they might be lying. Once inside, they started opening drawers, searching through cabinets, and going through documents all over the house. At first she assumed they were helping me with something important, but before long she realized that something wasn't right. According to Emma, my father began asking questions about old folders he believed I was hiding somewhere in the house. He wanted to know whether she had ever seen me storing boxes, documents, or sealed envelopes. Jennifer joined in as well, repeatedly asking where I kept certain files and whether Emma knew about any rooms or closets that usually remained locked. The more she answered that she didn't know anything, the more persistent they became, until eventually they started arguing with each other in front of her, convinced that the documents had to be somewhere inside the house. As I listened, I felt a mixture of anger and disbelief building inside me, but the worst part came next, because Emma told me that at one point she wanted to call the babysitter and ask what she should do. However, Jennifer took the phone out of her hands and told her there was no need to involve anyone else. That was the moment Emma became frightened. For the first time she realized the adults searching through the house were not there to help. They were there because they desperately wanted something, and they were not willing to leave without finding it. As the story continued, Emma began crying. She told me she had locked herself in her room for part of the time because she was scared. She could hear drawers opening, doors slamming, and voices arguing in other parts of the house. She also heard Jennifer repeatedly saying that I was hiding information and that sooner or later they would find what they were looking for. When they finally left, they had managed to put most things back where they belonged. But for a child her age, the damage had already been done. She stayed quiet for days because she didn't know whether she should tell me what happened, and because she was afraid it would create an even bigger conflict inside the family. That night I barely slept. Part of me was still trying to process what Emma had told me, but another part was already thinking about something I had completely forgotten during my trip: the security cameras. If what Emma was describing was true, everything should have been recorded. I went straight to the security system and started reviewing footage from the day she mentioned. At first all I saw were ordinary recordings of an empty house, but then a vehicle appeared on the screen that I recognized immediately. It was my father's car. I felt tension spread through my entire body as I watched the footage continue. I saw Robert step out of the vehicle alongside Jennifer. I watched them walk up to the front door, and then I saw something that made my heart sink. They used a key to enter the house, a key they had never been authorized to keep. Over the next several minutes I watched exactly what Emma had described: drawers being opened, filing cabinets being searched, private rooms being entered, and both of them moving through my home with complete confidence, as if they had every right to be there. But the hardest part was still ahead, because the interior cameras also captured their interaction with Emma. They recorded the questions, the pressure they placed on her, the way they tried to obtain information from a child who had no idea what was happening, and most importantly, they recorded the moment Jennifer took away her phone when she tried to contact another adult. When I saw that scene I had to stop the recording for several minutes, because for the first time I stopped viewing this as a family dispute about inheritance or documents. This was something much more serious. As I continued reviewing the footage, I discovered something else. Before leaving the house they had taken several folders and personal documents that did not belong to them. Some had nothing to do with inheritance matters at all, others contained private financial information, and some were simply personal family records they never should have touched. At that moment I understood that I was no longer dealing with a disagreement that could be resolved through a phone call or an uncomfortable family conversation. My father and my sister had entered my home illegally, intimidated my daughter, and removed private documents believing they would never face consequences. What neither of them realized was that they had just given me exactly what they had spent years searching for: evidence. Except this time the evidence wasn't against me, it was against them. And as I sat there watching the recordings late into the night, I realized that the next decision I made was going to change my family forever. That night I finished reviewing the recordings shortly after midnight. By then I had watched every important moment multiple times and there was no longer any room for doubt. What happened was not a misunderstanding. It was not a family visit that got out of hand. And it certainly was not an innocent attempt to locate important paperwork. The footage showed exactly what had happened. My father and my sister had used a key they were never supposed to keep, entered my property without permission, searched through private areas of my home, questioned my daughter about matters she knew nothing about, and left with documents that did not belong to them. For years I had tolerated accusations, suspicions, and constant pressure because I still believed that, despite everything, they were family. But while watching those recordings I finally understood that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The next morning I made a decision that surprised many people later when the full story became public. I did not call my father demanding answers. I did not call Jennifer to scream at her. And I did not post the recordings online to humiliate either of them. Instead, I did something much simpler and far more effective. I made several copies of every video file, gathered documentation showing what had been taken from the house, and scheduled a meeting with an attorney. Because if years of dealing with them had taught me anything, it was that direct confrontations only gave them time to invent new excuses, change their stories, and turn every situation into another emotional family argument where the truth became impossible to separate from manipulation. My attorney needed less than 10 minutes to tell me what I already suspected. The recordings were extremely clear. There was no ambiguity regarding what they showed, and there was no legitimate authorization that justified their presence inside my home. Furthermore, the fact that Emma was present during the entire incident made the situation significantly more serious, especially because the footage clearly showed them questioning a minor and preventing her from contacting another adult when she attempted to use her phone. The more we analyzed the evidence, the more obvious it became that this was not simply a family disagreement about inheritance, it was a series of actions carrying potentially serious legal consequences. Over the following days, things began moving quickly. The recordings were submitted, the relevant documents were provided, and a formal investigation began. Meanwhile, I remained silent, even when relatives started calling to ask why my father seemed nervous or why Jennifer was suddenly desperate to contact me. I simply explained that the matter was being handled through the appropriate channels and that there would be plenty of time to discuss everything once the facts were clear. That response seemed to frustrate them more than anything else, because they were accustomed to resolving conflicts through pressure, guilt, and emotional manipulation. They were not accustomed to dealing with objective evidence. My father's reaction was exactly what I expected. At first, he denied everything. He claimed he had every right to enter because he still considered himself family. He insisted he was only trying to locate information related to inheritance matters, and he even suggested that Emma had misunderstood what happened. However, every one of those explanations collided directly with the recordings. Because the cameras did not show a family visit, they showed a methodical search. They showed room after room being examined, and they showed documents being removed from the property. The harder he tried to justify himself, the more impossible it became to ignore reality. Jennifer responded differently. During the first few weeks, she tried to present herself as the victim. She claimed I was exaggerating, accused me of spying on family members with security cameras, and attempted to convince relatives that the entire situation was retaliation connected to old family disputes. But that argument began falling apart the moment people saw portions of the footage during the legal process. Because there is a major difference between hearing a story and watching a frightened child stand in her own home while two adults search through her belongings and pressure her for information. What happened next surprised almost everyone involved, because as investigators looked deeper into the documents my father and Jennifer had been so desperate to find, they uncovered information nobody expected. For years they had insisted there were irregularities connected to the family inheritance. But financial records revealed a very different story. Records showed transactions they had never mentioned, transfers of money that had quietly occurred years earlier, and financial decisions that had been concealed from other family members. The deeper investigators looked, the clearer it became that their obsession with finding documents was not about uncovering wrongdoing, it was about preventing certain questions from being asked. By the time the case reached court, the situation looked nothing like they imagined on the day they entered my house. They were no longer accusing me of hiding information. Now they were the ones trying to explain their own behavior. The recordings were presented as evidence. The recovered documents demonstrated exactly what had been taken, and multiple statements confirmed the emotional impact the incident had on Emma. Throughout the entire process, I remained focused on one thing: protecting my daughter. Because in the end, this was never really about inheritance. It was never truly about paperwork or property. It was about two adults deciding that their personal interests mattered more than the safety and well-being of a child. The consequences arrived soon afterward. My father and Jennifer faced significant legal and financial penalties, and they were required to return the documents they had taken. But to be honest, that was not what affected them the most. What truly damaged them was the loss of credibility. For years they had built a narrative in which they were victims of a great family injustice and I was the person hiding the truth. But once the evidence became public, that narrative collapsed completely. Relatives who had supported them for years began distancing themselves, and relationships they assumed would always remain intact disappeared almost overnight. As for Emma, recovery took time. For several weeks she remained uncomfortable inside her own home. She checked locks repeatedly and often asked whether anyone could come back while she was alone. Those conversations were difficult, but gradually she began feeling safe again, especially once she understood that the adults responsible for protecting her had actually stepped in and acted. And I think that became the most important lesson of this entire experience, because children do not need perfect parents. They need to know that when something frightening happens, someone will stand up and protect them. Today, years later, my house feels like a home again. Emma has grown older, the cameras are still there, and the locks were replaced long ago. But the most important changes are not physical, they are the boundaries I finally learned to establish. For far too long I confused family love with an obligation to tolerate unacceptable behavior. Now I understand those are two very different things. Because loving someone does not mean allowing them to manipulate you, intimidate you, or harm their people you care about most. In the end, my father and my sister spent years searching for evidence against me, convinced that some hidden document would eventually prove they were right. The irony is that the only evidence they ever found was the evidence that exposed them, and the only person who truly got what she was looking for was me. Because after everything that happened I gained something far more valuable than any inheritance. I gave my daughter her sense of safety back, and I reclaimed the peace that other people had spent years trying to take away.